Richard Pettigrew talking to us today. Richard is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bristol, and he's going to be talking about on choosing how to choose. So take it away, Richard.
Brilliant, thanks, Cal. Great, thanks everyone for coming along. So this is a project that I started I guess about a year ago. It had a sort of odd history that I wanted to prove exactly the opposite result from the one that I'm going to present today. So I was kind of using Lara Bouchak's risk-weighted expected utility theory, her alternative to standard expected utility theory, for a project I had about kind of looking at these long-termist arguments that people give and sort of arguing that they go wrong because they're sensitive to the risk attitudes that people have, or at least not that they go wrong necessarily, but they are at least sensitive to the risk attitudes that the chooser has. And Johan Gustafsson said, yeah, but you're using this decision theory, but we know it's wrong because it's diachronically inconsistent. There's a and which the definition of which I'll go into a little bit later on. But he said, look, there's just these kind of sure loss arguments against it. So we kind of know that's wrong. Expected utility theory is right, and so it should go. So I thought, okay, and I've never been convinced by these diachronic inconsistency or incoherence arguments. I want to try to say what's I think is bad about them. And then I think there's a way of kind of moving from what I think is bad about them to what a better way of testing a decision theory would be to try to figure out whether it's the right one or not. And I hoped that when you test Bouchak's risk-weighted expected utility theory using that test, it was going to come out as fine. So it was bad according to diachronic incoherence, but that's not the right way to test it. There's some alternative that's nearby, and I thought it was going to pass that. But it turns out, as I'll explain, that it doesn't pass that test either. But the general question, so I sort of was interested. That was the kind of motivation for it. But the talk itself will be a little bit broader than that, because I'm going to talk about Lara's theory, but I'm also going to talk about decision theories for imprecise probabilities, and also for decision theories for situations what people sometimes call Knightian or radical uncertainty, which is situations where you don't have any probabilities at all, precise or imprecise. So now it's become a project that's a little bit broader, and it's about decision theories more generally. So the project is something like this. Look, take any way we have of representing uncertainty, whether it's precise probabilities or imprecise probabilities, or complete uncertainty where we have no probabilities at all. For any one of them, there's a bunch of alternative decision theories out there. So if you represent uncertainty using precise probabilities, then there's expected utility theory, but there's also Bouchak's risk-weighted expected utility theory. But there's also actually a bunch of other ones out there I won't talk about. But Chris Bottomley and the other Timothy Williamson, the younger Timothy Williamson in Oxford, have another decision theory for precise probabilities that they've presented recently based on some work in economics in the 80s. That in some ways, actually, I now kind of think is probably a better alternative to expected utility theory than Bouchak's is. But and in fact, it does suffer from the problem I'm going to talk about today. But I didn't have kind of time between reading their paper and putting up the slides that to incorporate that. But in any case, the point is, if you represent uncertainty using precise probabilities, there's a bunch of alternatives out there. And so your question is, how do you choose between them? And I'll talk a bit later on about the different ways that economists and philosophers have tried to choose between them, tried to explain why one alternative is better than the other. And I'll say that, well, I mean, I'll arrogantly say that they all fail except for the one that I'm going to present, and then tell you what mine tells you to do. So that's for precise probabilities. For imprecise probabilities, I mean, in some ways, this is really well known in this literature, that there's just a host of different decision theories for imprecise probabilities. And there's some that have sort of worked their way to the top and that people favor now, but there's a whole bunch of them, and you might ask how you should, which one you should use. And then finally, for decisions under Knightian uncertainty, again, there was this kind of period in the 1950s where these were initially discussed by people like Abraham Wald and John Milner and Leonard Hurwitz and people in economics. And they came up with, again, a kind of host of different decision theories for this sort of situation of Knightian uncertainty. You can't, a radical uncertainty where you can't assign probabilities at all. So again, you've got a host of different decision theories. How can you choose between them? Okay, so that's the general kind of picture. We're in this situation where we need decision theories to help us make decisions under uncertainty. And that, these are often kind of real life decisions that they're used. And even if you kind of don't sit down and calculate everything precisely, you at least go through some sort of reasoning process that in some ways tracks or mimics what some of these decision theories do. But there's a whole range of them, and they all claim to kind of be normatively correct. They all claim to give the true facts about rational requirements. They're not just kind of tools that I'll talk about them being tools later on, but they're not just supposed to be sort of, a kind of heuristic that you might, pick up and use when you need to do something. They're, they're meant to issue in statements like it is rationally required for an individual with this precise probability function and these attitudes to risk when faced with this decision problem to do this thing. So they're supposed to be kind of correct. They're supposed to issue in correct normative statements. So we've got to try to figure out which one of them is correct, which one really does issue in the correct normative statements. And so that's the kind of project here. I want to describe the way that people have typically answered that question. Then I want to kind of say they don't work. Not necessarily that they're the wrong way to do it, but just that sometimes, for instance, they end in a sort of stalemate that we can't see any way out of. And so we need some sort of alternative. And so I'm going to present one, and then I'm going to tell you what that alternative tells us. Okay, can I actually move on slides? Okay, so throughout, sorry, I'll just make sure, I'll just minimize that thing on the side of the screen so I can actually see what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm just, just to have an example, can I actually do to see this properly? Is that better? That's better. Okay. Yeah, just to have an example in mind throughout. I know a lot of people in the audience already know about these decision theories, but I'm just going to have a kind of toy example, in some ways the simplest sort of example we could give to work through these different decision theories, just to give a sort of sense of each of them. Just so you kind of have some idea about the theories that I'm talking about. Some of them are a little bit less standard than others. So I'm going to present a few. I'm going to present expected utility theory, which I think most people will be aware of. Lara Bushak's risk-weighted expected utility theory, which fewer people will be aware of. I'll then present just one example of a decision theory for imprecise probabilities, the one that gets called the admissibility that Isaac Levi presented. But there is a host of other ones, but I can kind of talk about those if people are interested. And then I'll present Wald's minimax for Knightian uncertainty. This is really just to give a kind of flavor of the different things that are out there. And then I'll move on to the kind of central argument. Okay. So what's the setup? So, let's suppose, actually, given that I'm here, I almost could do this, but let's suppose I kind of have brought with me to the talk today an urn that's opaque, and you can't see what's inside. And I tell you one of two things is true of it. It's either got one yellow ball in it and 3 blue balls, or it's got 1 blue ball, 3 yellow balls in it. And then I don't actually have colored balls in this this urn, but suppose I did, and I'm going to pick one out, kind of keep it in my hand, and then I'm going to offer you a choice. I'm going to say, look, you can either choose a sure thing or a gamble. Choose the sure thing, you're just going to get 2 units of utility for sure. Okay. If you choose the gamble, on the other hand, you're going to get 1 unit of utility if the ball I drew was blue, and 4 units if it were yellow. I'm just going to assume throughout that we have some way of making sense of this talk of units of utility. Some people are going to say, look, they're only defined relative to a decision theory, but we can come back to that, kind of how that question interacts with the argument later on. But for the moment, let's just assume we've got some sensible way of talking about units of utility. So that's the situation, standard sort of situation. You can have a sure thing, which kind of is guaranteed to give you a kind of middle payout, or you can take some gamble, which could give you a low payout, could give you a high payout. Figure out what to do in this situation where you don't know the composition of the urn, and you don't know indeed what's drawn from the urn. So expected utility theory. Expected utility theory doesn't tell you immediately at this point what you should do because you haven't set probabilities yet. But a natural thing to say is, look, I'm indifferent between the two urns. I don't know which of the two compositions of the urn Richard's actually brought to the talk. So, and if it's one of them, then it's 25% likely to be blue. If it's the other one, it's 75% likely to be blue, and then the other way around for yellow. And so I'm just going to split the difference and think it's 50-50 between blue and yellow. Natural sort of thing to think. It's not compelled, or unless you think principle of indifference compelled, it's not compelled. But that's a natural thing to think. So in that sort of situation, expected utility theory just says calculate the expected utilities and pick one of the ones that has maximal expected utility. In this case, there's only one that has maximal expected utility. It's the gamble. It has an expected utility of 2.5, whereas the sure thing has expected utility of 2, so you're rationally required to take the gamble. So that's expected utility theory, reasonably straightforward. Risk-weighted expected utility theory, or rank-dependent utility theory, which is the version due to John Quiggin that Bouchac's theory is built on, tells you to do something different, or at least could tell you to do something different. What you should do in this situation depends on what your attitudes to risk are. So again, let's just, it's a precise probability decision theory, and so we've got to set our precise probabilities, so let's just assume we set them as before, 50-50. Now, what does it tell you to do? Well, first of all, it tells you to set your risk function. Now, the risk functions, I'm not going to have time to kind of go into all the ins and outs of what it is, but just think of it as a way of transforming probabilities. And that won't make, it's a bit vague at the moment, but you'll see how those transform probabilities factor into the decision in a second, and then it might make a little bit more sense what that means. But roughly, it takes probabilities and gives back something like probabilities. They're not really probabilities, they're kind of decision weights. They're still measured between 0 and 1. And they're going to factor into your decision in this following way. And you use that risk function together with the utilities of the outcomes and the probabilities to give what Bouchac calls the risk-weighted expected utility of an option. And what risk-weighted expected utility theory tells you to do is just maximize that quantity. So what's the risk-weighted expected utility? Well, the best way to see it is to look at gamble. So what risk-weighted expected utility tells you to do is, first of all, take the minimum amount of utility that so the amount you're guaranteed to get. So when I look at gamble, I'm absolutely sure to get at least 1 unit of utility. I might get more, but I'm at least going to get 1. So I give myself that for sure. Okay, so if you see down at the bottom of the slide, that's the 1 at the beginning of the definition of risk-weighted expected utility. And then you say, okay, but I might get more. I might get 4. How much more is that than the 1 that I'm going to get? Well, that's 3 units more. And then I'm going to weight that extra utility that I might get if I get the best case outcome. I'm going to weight that by the decision weight that was given by my risk function when applied to the probability of getting that extra amount of utility. So it's the amount of utility I'm guaranteed to get at least, which is 1, plus the amount that I might get extra over and above that 1, weighted by this new decision weight that Bouchac and Quiggin introduced, which takes my probability of getting the extra, the case where the yellow ball's drawn and I get the 4, skewed by the risk function. So I take 50%, my probability that I'm going to get the yellow ball, I skew it by the risk function, so I square it, and then I multiply it by the extra utility I'm going to get. Now, you might think, that's kind of a weird thing to do, and of course, in some ways, it isn't just a natural thing to do. You're not going to that's not just going to pop into your head. I mean, Quiggin didn't become famous for something that just, pops into anyone's head when they think about this. But there's a whole bunch of arguments why you should do this. Bouchac gives a representation theorem for doing this sort of thing, which generalizes Quiggin's one. Just for people who are interested, Quiggin basically did this in the case where the probabilities are given to you from the outside. So like von Neumann-Morgenstern version of expected utility theory. Bouchac then did it for cases where you come up with the probabilities yourself. So subjective utility theory. So hers is equivalent to, or hers is the version of Savage's. decision theory. Okay. So the key thing to take home, rather than the technicalities, is that what Bushak's theory allows you to do is to give greater weight to worst case outcomes if you're a risk averse person. So what's happened here is I've taken the gamble, sure thing, the one, and then I want to look at how much more I get in the best case scenario, so 4 minus 1. If I were doing expected utility theory, I'd just give the probability. I'd just weight that by the probability that I get that extra, and I'd get the expected utility. But instead, I weight it by this risk-weighted, this transformed version of the probability. And if what my risk function does is reduce that number, that 50%, as squaring it does, reduces it to 25%, then I'm giving less weight to that better outcome, and therefore more weight comparatively to the worst case outcome. So that's a risk-averse approach. And if you notice in this kind of case, it allows you to say that the sure thing is the right thing to do, which is a lot of people's reaction to this in certain sorts of cases. You know, take the sort of overly dramatic case where the 2 units of utility are given by 2 lives saved. Often in cases like this, where you could save 2 lives for sure, or save 1 with 50% and 4 with 50%, people will go risk averse and go for the sure thing. Expected utility theory can't explain that, and less lives have diminishing marginal utility, which nobody thinks. And so this allows you to kind of recover that intuition that sometimes we should go against expected utility theory and give greater weight to worst case outcomes. And so Bushak's theory recovers that. Okay. Now I'm just going to, so that's Bushak's theory. Then, so those are the 2 that I've presented so far are both precise probability theories. Okay, so they're precise probability decision theories. But what about if you think we should be imprecise? So this is the kind of case that I set up where you don't know the composition of the urn that I brought with me. You don't know whether it's 1 blue and 3 yellow, or 1 yellow and 3 blue. Is the kind of case that imprecise probability theorists kind of jump on and say, aha, in that case, you've no idea you don't know what the chance is of pulling out the blue ball. And so you shouldn't give a precise probability to it. You don't know how likely it is that it's a blue ball that comes out, so you shouldn't have a precise probability that measures how likely it is. So they say something like, no, really what should happen is you should have a set of probabilities. And how you set up the set of probabilities is different for different people, but one natural thing to think is something like, well, you might have something like ranges of probabilities for these 2 different sorts of different options. So the probability of the blue ball being drawn is not 50%. It's the range from 25% to 75%. And then the probability of the yellow ball being drawn is just the range the other way around. So that's the, and the way to represent that is by a set of probability functions that give these ranges. So that's the kind of standard setup in imprecise probability theory. Lots of different ways to interpret what these sets of probabilities are, but I won't go into those. Okay, so in that kind of case, you've now got these sets of probabilities, but how do you now make a decision using them? Because, okay, we can calculate expected utilities given each of the probability functions in the set, but that just gives us a set of expectations. What am I supposed to do with that? So what Levi's suggestion is this thing that gets called e-admissibility. And it says that an option's impermissible rationally, you shouldn't choose it if for each of the probability functions in the representer, the set of probabilities, in each of the probability functions in your set of probabilities, there's some alternative option that has greater expected utility by the lights of that probability function. So if you use this rule in this particular case, then both of the options are permissible. And this is quite a standard sort of thing to happen with Levi's, generally with imprecise probability decision theories, is that they can often be kind of lenient. They can often be quite permissive, can make a number of different things because the different probabilities within the set can disagree about which is better. And so when they disagree often, not always, but often these decision theories will tell you, well, we should be permissive in that kind of case. Some of them don't, but your admissibility does. And in this particular case, it says, look, if your probability for blue is 0.25, which is one of the ones in your probability function, then gamble has the highest expected utility. If on the other hand, your probability for blue is 0.75, then sure thing has the highest expected utility. And so you should, both of them are permissible. Okay, because so that's Levi's, and then finally Wald's decision theory is the one that people probably know. You may know it anyway, but sort of most well known to philosophers through Rawls's veil of ignorance thought experiment. And it's the one that Rawls thinks you should use in the original position when you're sort of deciding on institutions and fair distribution of resources behind the veil of ignorance. And what it says is that you should just pick the option whose worst case outcome is best. So in some ways, it's like Bouchac's theory that allows you to kind of put more weight on worst case scenarios, but it's the most extreme version. And it tells you put all of your weight on the worst case outcomes, only care about those and just rank options by their worst case outcomes. Okay. So in this case, of course, sure thing is going to come out as the only permissible option because gamble has a worst case outcome. So that's those are the decision theories. And I mean, so in each case, so in the case of precise probabilities, I presented two. So we can see there that there's a kind of question mark over which ones you should use. In the case of imprecise probabilities and Knightian uncertainty, I just presented one each, but there's a whole bunch of others. So in the case of imprecise probabilities, you've got things like gamma maximin. You've got something people sometimes call global dominance. I think Sarah Moss or Brian Weatherson calls caprice. There's a bunch of different decision theories out there. And then in the Knightian uncertainty cases, again, there's a bunch. There's maximin. There's also maxi-max, which tells you should only pay attention to the best case outcome. And so, okay. So in each case, we've got this sort of range of different decision theories. So how should we choose between them? So here's one suggestion, or one way that people often go. It's not really often fleshed out as a specific methodology, but it is, in fact, the methodology that's often used in these cases. That your decision theory should match your specific intuitive judgment. So what I mean by that is that someone presents a decision problem, for instance, the one I've been working through between sure thing and gamble. They ask you to kind of give your intuitions about what's rationally permissible in that case. And then they ask whether the decision theory allows those, renders that judgment. So does the decision theory's judgment about what's rationally permissible match your intuitive judgment? So for instance, you could have the intuitive judgment that should be at least permissible to take the sure thing in the case that we talked about, the gamble versus sure thing choice. It doesn't have to be mandated, but it should at least be permissible. I mean, I'm talking relative to the kind of natural probabilities, relative to the probabilities I've been given throughout. Because it clearly is permissible relative to some probabilities, but even according to expected utility theory. But this is saying using the ones that we specify. And so if you did make that sort of intuitive judgment, then expected utility theory would be out. Risk-weighted expected utility theory would be in, because at least as long as you have risk-averse risk attitudes, then sure thing's permissible. E-admissibility makes it permissible, as we saw, because it makes both of them permissible, and maximin makes it permissible because it makes it mandated. Okay, so all looking good. We've got a way to choose between decision theories. It rules out the orthodox one, but it gives us a bunch of other ones. But perhaps not so fast, because there are at least other sorts of intuitive judgments we make. They're not our responses to specific decision problems, but more to kind of structural features of the decision theory. Features that tell you, For instance, as in the case that I've given here, if you make decisions about these two options in a particular way, then you should make decisions about these two related options in a particular way. So they're not just kind of presenting you with a particular case and eliciting your intuitive judgment, but but rather they're kind of presenting structural features. So for instance, the famous axioms that is the independence axiom, which says if you prefer one option to another, so O1 to O2, then you should prefer the following mixed options in a particular way. So take a third option you might get and take the mixed option that says you get that with probability P and O1 with probability 1 minus P. Or you get this third option, O3 with probability P and O2 with probability 1 minus P. Then the independence axiom says, look, if you prefer O1 to O2, then you should prefer O3 mixed with O1 to O3 mixed with O2, where the mixtures are done in the same way. So that's the independence axiom, and famously, expected utility theory satisfies it, but none of these alternatives do. So, as we can see, kind of flipping back between the specific judgments and the intuitive judgments. I mean, if you think independence axiom is correct, then we've got a case where our expected utility theory failed in the first one and the other ones succeeded, but in the second case, expected utility theory succeeds and the other ones fail. Of course, these aren't all the decision theories there are in the world. Yeah, I mean, in the end, it's going to end up being very difficult to find ones that satisfy all of people's certain specific intuitions and their structural intuitions. Now, what's the problem with this sort of approach? Why should we not just choose decision theories in this way by appealing to intuitive judgments? My reason for sort of rejecting this is not that I think intuitions are somehow deeply suspicious or anything like that. In some sense, I think it's going to be hard to do certain sorts of normative theorizing without at least some appeal to intuitions. The problem is that this gives rise to a stalemate pretty easily. So, in the debate between these two, people just end up citing these two intuitive judgments against one another. Some people just say, but look, the independence axiom just looks so natural. And other people will say, but yeah, surely it's got to be permissible to choose the sure thing. That shouldn't be rationally. And so people take one to be more foundational than the other and base their theories on it, but it doesn't look like we're going to make a great deal of progress. And I should say, you also get this kind of conflict within a single person. You might think that was just a debate between different decision theorists that's going to be a problem like this. But actually, I mean, for myself, I think the independence axiom is very plausible, and I also think sure thing should be permissible. So it can also happen within a single person. Okay, so how might you move beyond intuitive judgments? And this kind of takes me, I think, to a methodology that I've liked generally in normative theorizing, which is a kind of teleological approach, I suppose. And this is kind of the approach I like in theorizing about norms for epistemic states or doxastic states, like beliefs. It's that intuitions are kind of all very well, but these things that we have, like doxastic states or decision theories, are things we use for particular purposes. So in case of our doxastic states, we use them partly to make choices. And so we might judge them by how well they do that, how well they kind of play the role or act as a means for getting the things that we want, but we also use them to represent the world. And so we might judge them in that way as well. You might judge them by how accurate they are. And once you've given some sort of measure of these, the extent to which they achieve these goals, you can then start theorizing about, you can then start asking pretty concrete questions about what is the best way to achieve that goals, what sort of features should your beliefs definitely not have if you want to achieve these goals to the best possible extent. And that's kind of, I think, what the sort of motivating aim of accuracy first epistemology is. But also, I think this sort of approach can be applied in decision theory. I mean, I'm kind of making this connection with accuracy first epistemology, partly because there's actually kind of deeper mathematical connections between this project that I'm doing at the moment and the accuracy first stuff, which we can get onto later. but in some ways the motivation for thinking like this comes out of this paper by Mark Shervish from the 80s, I think, where he kind of explains a way of judging doxastic states by how well they lead you to make decisions, and that allows you to kind of measure them in a particular way. And once you measure them in this particular way, you get a whole range of interesting results about what you should do. I similarly think we should do something similar with decision theories, and that's kind of what I'm talking about here. But let me talk this through. So the idea is something like this. Look, at decision theory, gives out these normative claims and thereby kind of guides actions given, the values that you have and the doxastic states that you have and maybe the risk attitudes you have. We can think of it, we can judge it as a sort of tool that we use to try to get the stuff we want, namely whatever gives us utility. Okay, so that gives us a kind of goal for decision theories. Now we can ask the question, which decision theories get us that goal best, if you like? And I think this is the kind of thought behind arguments that broadly I'm going to call exploitability arguments, that include things like money pump arguments and diachronic inconsistency arguments. And I'm going to talk through one of those, and then I'm going to say why I think those don't work, and then I'm going to essentially transform that argument, or in what I think of as improve that argument I don't think works into an argument I do think works, that is the kind of main one that I'm wanting to present, this self-recommendation argument. Okay, so let's start off with exploitability arguments. So here's a really kind of flat-footed and naive way of saying why certain decision theories are kind of bad tools. Now, I'm saying it's flat-footed and naive because there's been a huge literature on trying to kind of show how to avoid these things using resolute choice and sophisticated choice and all these sorts of things. But I'm just going to give the kind of basic version of it to let you see how it goes, because I don't think things like resolute choice and so on are going to help us with the problem I'm going to bring up. Okay, so take maximin, just the kind of, in some ways, the most straightforward of all the decision theories we've been talking about, the one that just says, only look at the worst cases for each of the options, rank them by their worst cases. Okay. So suppose, first of all, okay, so I've got my urn again, and I've drawn the ball and I've kind of held it in my hand. And what I've said to you is, I want you to choose between, just the choice that we've been talking about, sure thing, I'm now calling sure thing 1 and gamble 1. Where sure thing 1 gives you 2 units of utility for sure, gamble 1 gives you 1 if the blue ball was the one that was drawn, and 4 if it was yellow. So choose between those two. So as a maxi-minor, you think, okay, it's got to be sure thing 1, so you choose that. And 10 minutes later, I come back to you and I say, okay, another choice. Still haven't shown you which ball it is. You still don't know what it is. Now I want you to make a different choice. I want you to choose between sure thing 2 and gamble 2. Sure thing 2 gives you 2 units of utility for sure. That's extra units of utility over and above whatever you got out of the first choice I gave you. Gamble 2 gives you 4 units of utility if it was a blue ball that I drew, and 1 unit of utility if it was yellow. So basically the same as gamble 1, but with the utilities switched. So either Bouchard's theory with a sufficiently risk-averse risk function, or maximin tell you that in both of those cases you should choose sure thing 1 and then sure thing 2. But, as it's easy to see, if you'd chosen gamble 1 and then gamble 2, then you would have ended up with more utility for sure than if you'd chosen sure thing 1 and sure thing 2. You'd have got 5 units of utility, 1 plus 4 or 4 plus 1. And if you chose gamble 1, gamble 2 versus 2 plus 2 or 2 plus 2. So this is what people sometimes mean. It's a kind of naive statement of what is sometimes called diachronic inconsistency, namely that there's some sequence of choices that I could present to you such that if you were to approach both of those choices using the decision theory in question, you would end up making a sequence of choices when there's an alternative sequence of choices you might have made that would have been guaranteed to leave you better off, give you more utility for sure. Okay, so that's diachronic incoherence, and a lot of people think that's it. That rules out maximin, that rules out REU. This is the thing that Johann Gustafsson told me was the reason I shouldn't be using Bouchard's theory. So here's a sort of worry about diachronic incoherence. I'm really going to talk about the first one. I'm not so interested in the second one, though I think there's a neatness to the argument I'm going to give that it also answers the second worry. The first one is just that it seems rather hasty to dismiss a decision theory on the basis that it leads to a bad outcome when faced with only with certain decision problems, sequences of decision problems. So all that the diachronic inconsistency argument shows is that there exists a sequence of decision problems such that were you faced with them, you would choose a sequence of options such that there's an alternative sequence of options that's guaranteed to be better. So it shows that it has some sort of really poor performance when it faces that sequence of decision problems. It leads to this kind of dominated sequence of actions. You might think that's really bad, and it is really bad. Dominated sequence of actions leaves free utility on the table. But one way to think about this, sort of picturesque way to think about it, is look, if decision theory is just a tool for getting you what you want, you tend not to throw away tools on the basis that they don't perform well in a single or a set of applications that you might use them for. You tend to ask, okay, but how well does it perform across the board, if you like? How well does it perform in all of the application settings where I might use it? And then you try to perhaps take some sort of average performance, or you try to kind of ask how you would expect it to perform when you look across the whole range of applications and look at its performance there. So one problem that arises with these diachronic inconsistency arguments is that they don't allow these decision theories to redeem themselves by their excellent performance elsewhere. And so you might think, okay, it's just a bit hasty to dismiss a decision theory based on diachronic inconsistency. What I should do instead is look at its performance across the board and ask, how well does it do across the board? But there's a sort of problem with that. How are we going to judge how a decision theory does across the board? Because when we do that, we're looking at all the different decision problems, or maybe sequences of decision problems, that we might face. We don't know which ones we will in fact face. We might look at all the different ones that we might face, and then we might try, and then we look at how well the decision theory kind of serves us in using, when we face those decision problems. And that's just going to be kind of what utility you get from the option that they tell you to choose. Or if they make a bunch of options permissible, you've got to randomize or have some way of picking between them. But you look at all these different decision problems you might face and all the different states of the world that you're kind of uncertain between. And you get a different performance for the decision theory at each of those. Some of them will be better, some of them will be worse. How do you then aggregate all that performance across this whole range of applications to give an overall judgment of these decision theories that you can then use to tell which ones you should use and which ones you shouldn't? And the problem is the standard way that we do that is decision theory itself. If I've got a whole range of possibilities that I'm uncertain between, and I've got some thing that I'm assessing, and that thing that I'm assessing performs differently in each of these different situations between which I'm uncertain, then how do I kind of assess that holistically to say how good it is kind of on average or in expectation or something? Well, I use decision theory. If I'm an expected utility theorist, and I take my probabilities of all those different situations, and I take the expected utility of the thing that I'm assessing. If I'm Lara Bushak, I take my risk function and my probabilities across them, and I take the risk-weighted expected utility. So the problem with kind of expanding out the diachronic inconsistency argument like this to allow us to assess not just the decision theory's performance in faced with these particular sequences of decisions that, have been presented to them, but across all of the possible ones, The problem is that we need a decision theory in order to make that sort of assessment. But actually, I don't think it's such a substantial problem, because one thing that you might naturally say is, well, look, ask the decision theory itself, the one that you're assessing, what it would think about its performance across all of these. So if you're expected utility theory, then ask it, in expectation, is your own performance across this whole range of possible decision problems I might face and states of the world between which I'm uncertain, is your whole performance, is your performance overall, one of the best? Or is there some alternative decision theory I could have used instead that would, in expectation, be better than you? Or if you're Lara Bushak, you might say, look, give me my probability function, my risk function, and now ask, now I'm uncertain between all of these different decision problems I might face and also between different states of the world. And I know how much utility I'll get from using, Bushak's theory when faced with that decision problem and at that state of the world. And now I've got to figure out how good it is kind of across the board. Well, use risk-weighted expected utility theory to ask it of itself whether it's one of the best. So this is the self-recommendation test. Decision theory is self-recommending if were you to apply it to the choice between different decision theories, it would include itself among the permissible options. And I'm going to kind of walk through that. I've just given a very vague overview. I'm going to walk through this in a little bit of detail. And what we're going to see is the expected utility theory gets the thumbs up from this test. Bushak's theory gets thumbs down. E-admissibility gets the thumbs down. And indeed, all the existing decision theories for imprecise probabilities get the thumbs down. But Maximin gets the thumbs up. But as we'll see, Maximin gets the thumbs up for a kind of trivial reason. Basically, that everything is judged on a par according to that. Okay, so just a little bit more precision here to explain. So let's suppose we know that we're going to face two-state, two-option decisions, so the ones that we represent by a 2x2 payoff matrix. So that's where there's two states of the world between which I'm uncertain and two options that I might choose. And the options have a minimum utility and a maximum utility, minimum utility of 0, maximum utility of 1. That's just completely conventional, could be anything. So a decision problem is specified by just specifying those 4 payoffs. So that's the decision theories, and we're not sure which one we're going to face. We're uncertain which we're going to face. We're also uncertain of the state of the world. We're uncertain of SI or S1 or S2. And also, because some of these decision theories will end up quite often giving rise to permissible, both options being permissible, we need a tiebreaker proposition. And that just tells you what, in fact, you will do when faced with a decision problem where your decision theory tells you that both of the options are permissible. T1 tells you you'll choose option 1, T2 tells you to choose option 2. So now I'm going to create this meta decision problem. I call it a meta decision problem, largely for lack of a better name. It's not a great name. Meta decision problem. And this meta states are the states over which the options in this decision problem take the following form. So they specify, first of all, the decision that you'll face, A, B, C, D, the payoff matrix. They specify the state of the world, either S1 or S2. And they specify your tiebreaker proposition, the one that tells you what you'll do if you, in fact, face a decision where your decision theory tells you both are permissible. So those are the states of the world. And then the options that you must choose between are decision theories. And decision theories are just, we can just think of them as functions that take decision problems, as well as you've got in the background your probabilities over the states of the world and whatever else the decision theory needs, like your risk attitudes. It takes the decision problem and it tells you which are the permissible options. And then the utility of a decision theory at one of these meta states is going to be, it's going to tell you which option you're going to pick. And then the utility of the decision theory of that is whatever the utility of that option that it tells you to pick is at that state of the world. So we've now got a way of a set of states, and we've got a set of options, all these decision theories, and we've got a way of measuring the utility of a decision theory at one of these states. Final thing that we're going to need is a probability function over these. Now, this is the kind of part of the project that's in some ways sort of incomplete. So I've kind of been looking at this for the most straightforward way of doing this. And I mean, I can talk about it later on if people are interested, but I've expanded out and generalized in various ways. But the kind of goal, the ultimate ideal of this project would be to get a really lovely general theorem about this. But so far, at least, it's not been forthcoming. But here's at least one way of specifying the probabilities. The idea is I've got to now extend my probabilities for just S1 and S2 to probabilities, those states, for the original states, to probabilities for these meta states. So I have to have some decision, I have to have some probability over the different decision problems that I might face, and also over the tiebreaker function, the tiebreaker proposition. So how likely is it that this is how I break ties? How likely is it that this other way is the way I break ties? So what I'm just going to assume and in a lot of ways, this is just to kind of make various parts of the computation tractable. I'm just going to assume that the decision that you face, the state that you're in, and the tiebreaker proposition that's true are all independent of one another. So learning what decision problem you face doesn't tell you anything about the state of the world, nor vice versa. And also doesn't tell you how you're likely to break ties. That's sort of plausible in lots of cases. It's not plausible in others, but that's a kind of natural first way of representing this. And for the results I'm going to present here, I'm just going to assume that's a uniform distribution over the possible decisions I can talk about. Some of the generalizations I've got, later if people are interested, but this is the natural way to start. Okay, so what are the results? So essentially, let's look at, so I should just start off by saying you can just prove completely analytically and for any probability function whatsoever that the expected utility theory, any way of putting probabilities over the decision problems, you can just prove that expected utility theory is self-recommending. It will always think of itself as, it won't just think of itself as one of the permissible options, it will think of itself as uniquely best, or at least it won't, anything that agrees with it, it will think of, anything that disagrees with it on any particular decision, any set of decisions that have positive measure, essentially, it will think of as worse than it. So expected utility theory is great. It doesn't just work for the uniform distribution, it works for any distribution. It will think of itself as at least one of the permissible ones, and very often it will think of itself as best. What about Bouchak's theory? So let's suppose that Bouchak herself has the risk attitudes that she kind of uses throughout the book, which are actually quite extreme risk attitudes, but they're kind of mathematically nice, which is why she uses them. These are the risk attitudes represented by the risk function that takes your probability and squares it to give those decision weights that I was talking about earlier. Suppose she's there and she's looking across all the possible decision problems that she might face, as well as the different states of the world that she might be in. And suppose she's got a tiebreaker proposition, but actually in this case, that doesn't make any difference. She's looking across all of them and she's asking herself, which decision theory should I use? So she's going to use her risk-weighted expected utility theory with her risk function to choose between the two of them. Either she's choosing whether to use her own decision theory with her risk function or some alternative. And the alternative that I'm just going to mention, though as we'll see, there's a whole range of them, is the one that's Maurice Allais at the bottom right, who's kind of one of the originators of kind of risk sensitive decision theories. Allais has this slightly different risk attitude. He's slightly less risk averse. He takes probabilities and doesn't raise them to the power 2, raises them to the power 1.5. So he's very slightly risk averse than Bouchak is. It will turn out, in fact, that Bouchak prefers to make decisions using Allais' theory than using her own. But it's not like you can just shift over to allays and think, great, now sorted, because it turns out that allay would prefer to use John Quiggin's risk attitudes, which are very slightly less risk averse again. And this is a general feature. Basically, if you're risk averse, you have risk attitudes that are risk averse in Bushak's theory, you'll prefer to use a decision theory that is less risk averse, that's closer to expected utility theory. One rather strange feature, I have no mathematical explanation for this, is none of them think of expected utility theory as being better than themselves. They think of something closer to it as being better than themselves, but not expected utility theory itself. Now, suppose you go the other way and you think about risk-seeking people, because one nice thing about Bushak's theory is that it allows risk-seeking people as well. I didn't know of any risk-seeking philosophers, so I had to kind of turn to the world of rock climbing. So suppose you've got Janja Garnbret, who has very risk-seeking attitudes. She raises her probabilities to the power of a half. You take square roots of them. That makes her kind of very risk-seeking. That means she gives more weight to the best case scenarios. And she's looking at what she would, this kind of meta decision problem. She's trying to decide which decision theory she would like to use when she makes decisions. And it turns out she would prefer to use Alex Honnold's risk attitudes instead, which are slightly less risk-seeking. They're closer again to expected utility theory. A mystery about this is that they do, in fact, prefer expected utility theory to themselves, whereas the risk-seeking ones the risk-averse ones wanted to get closer, but didn't actually prefer expected utility theory itself. These ones, in fact, do prefer expected utility theory itself. And that's kind of what's shown on this. And this is kind of looks, and actually doing this on Zoom is less straightforward than I thought. But this looks sort of super complicated to begin with, but it hopefully isn't. Let's just focus to begin with on the purple line. Okay. So the purple line, what it measures is from, say, Lara Bushak's point of view, who has risk function p squared, p to the power 2. She's looking at other risk functions of that form, so that is p raised to some power. And she's asking, how much more would I like to use those than I would like to use my own? And so at 2 itself, she obviously thinks of them as being equal. So the difference between them is 0. There's no amount more that she would prefer to use her own one than to use her own one. But as you can see, as we get more and more, well, closer and closer to 1, that is closer and closer to expected utility theory, less and less risk averse. She thinks of these as better and better, and it peaks at around 1.51, something like that. The peak isn't particularly important. The important thing from this point of view is just that there's a positive part of this line, essentially. That's what shows that it's not risk. That's that it's not self-recommending. It doesn't think of itself as best. There is some alternative decision theory, risk-weighted expected utility theory, with a different risk attitude that it thinks of as improving on itself. And just to illustrate that, you can kind of notice from that green line, which represents, raising p to the power 1, which basically is just expected utility theory. There is no positive part of that because it's self-recommending. Okay. So that's what happens with Bushak's theory with these kind of standard styles of risk functions. In fact, people often don't use this sort of risk function. People sometimes use S-shaped risk functions. Essentially, the same thing happens for those. Again, what the person with a quite extreme S function wants is to be slightly less extreme. Okay. So that's the risk-weighted version. So risk-weighted expected utility theory is not self-recommending, and so it doesn't seem like it's a good tool to use, or it doesn't recommend itself as being a good tool. What about e-admissibility? I mean, I'll just quickly run through this because it's essentially the same sort of point. So suppose you've got Sarah Moss, who likes e-admissibility, let's suppose, and she's got these imprecise probabilities between 25% and 75% that the ball that I draw was blue. but she doesn't know what decision problem you're going to face. She's going to face, and she's asking what would she prefer. It turns out she'd prefer the decision theory that Jennifer Carr, I'm ascribing to Jennifer Carr here, is the decision theory that I'm calling midpoint expected utility theory, which just basically says when you've got imprecise probabilities that kind of have this nice range structure like this, you should just use expected utility theory, but with the precise probability that's just the midpoint of the range. Now, no imprecise probabilist likes that decision rule because it essentially means that imprecise probabilities are, for all practical purposes, like precise probabilities. But in any case, the admissibility prefers that. In fact, all of the decision rules, the extant decision rules for imprecise probability prefer that. Okay, I should just, before I wrap up, I should just say Minimax, as I said, is self-recommending. Why is that? Well, just for a completely trivial reason. Think about Minimax. It looks across all possible states of the world, and it looks at the worst case. It looks at how an option performs in its worst case. But basically, for any decision theory whatsoever, its worst case is the same. If in this situation where there's bounds to utility, where there's kind of, 0 is the lowest a utility something can get, and 1 is the highest, and there's possibilities in which one of the options has 0 for at a state of both of the options have 0 at a state of the world, both the options have 1 at the state of the world. So in those cases, the worst case for any decision theory is exactly the same. It's the case where it gives 0 out, and the best case is exactly the same. It's the case where it gives 1 out. And so basically any of the existing theories for Knightian uncertainty are going to be self-recommending because they think of their worst case as just exactly the same as the worst case of all the others, think of the best cases as worse. And so same for the Hurwitz criterion and all the other ones. So if all you can look at as best case and worst case, then you're going to be self-recommending. So that's the self-recommendation test. So it gives you expected utility theory, is kind of passes it. Risk-weighted expected utility theory doesn't. E-admissibility, maximality, gamma, maximin, I haven't talked about those other ones. They don't pass it. Midpoint expected utility theory, which nobody likes, does pass it. Knightian uncertainty cases, they all pass it. Now, I should just a couple of things just to say before finishing. One is, of course, passing this test is not a good thing. Well, I mean, it's a good thing in the sense that you've not failed it, but it doesn't mean it isn't kind of point in favor of your theory. It's just that failing it is a strike against. So, for instance, take the kind of anything goes decision theory, which basically says in every decision problem all options are permissible. Then that's going to be self-recommending, but it's a pretty hopeless decision theory. So self-recommending is a bit like, coherence of a scientific theory or logical theory. It would be bad, and I actually don't think this, but a lot of people think it's bad to have an incoherent theory, but it's not necessarily good to be coherent. You can be coherent and just unfathomably wrong. So this is a similar sort of thing. This thing recommends itself. It says of itself that it's best, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right one or something like that. But the final thing to say is, like, what exactly is the, how do we state this argument? And one way to state the argument that a theory that fails the self-recommendation test is not our correct decision theory. It's just as follows. So as I said at the beginning, decision theories are not just supposed to be tools. They're not just something. They're supposed to give true answers to questions about what's rationally required of you. Now, suppose that my decision theory is correct. Suppose my Bushak theory is correct. It gives the rational, the true statements about what's rationally required of me. One of the statements it makes, according to what I've just been talking about, is that it is not the correct theory. It says of itself, don't use me. And so one of its statements, one of its outputs is risk-weighted expected utility theory with the risk attitudes that you have is not rationally permitted. And so it has a sort of self-undermining aspect in that sense. So that's one way to kind of put the argument. But the other way, I think, is just to say, look, we judge these things as tools, and tools we judge by how well they perform a function, and we've got to look at the function of a tool across its whole range of application. And when you do that, and you use the decision theory itself to assess the thing across its whole range of application, and the thing says of itself that it's not the best to use, then it's not a good decision theory. Okay, I'll finish there. Thanks.
Great. Well, let's take a couple minutes break, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Let's meet back at 5 past.